Tuesday morning, certified letter in my mailbox, signed by Paulette Voss, HOA president, white Escalade, power-tripping Karen who's never read a single zoning law. Inside, 72 hours. Sell the log cabin I built myself over 3 brutal summers, or $500 a day fines kick in, plus a forced lien on my title. The violation? My rustic cabin doesn't meet community standards. No real rules broken, no neighbor complaints, just her deciding my family land, deeded since 1974, doesn't fit her perfect little vision. I stood on the porch, letter trembling, red-tailed hawks circling overhead, heart pounding. This wasn't just a fine. This was them trying to steal my home. Something inside me snapped. I didn't sell. I did something they never saw coming. If an HOA tried to force you out of your own cabin in 72 hours, what's the first thing you'd fight back with? Drop it in the comments and tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Let me back up about 14 years, because this story doesn't start with that letter. It starts with sawdust, a secondhand table saw, and a man who just buried his father. My name is Garrett Holt. I'm a retired civil road engineer from Asheville, North Carolina, or at least semi-retired, meaning I still consult 2 days a week because idle hands make me insane. When my dad passed in 2009, he left me 11 acres in a remote pocket of the Blue Ridge that he'd owned since 1974. The land had a creek, second-growth hardwood timber, and a falling-down structure that had once been a hunting cabin before a generation of neglect turned it into a glorified lean-to with a wood stove that vented directly into regret. I spent 3 summers rebuilding it myself, poured a new foundation by hand, ran my own electrical conduit, properly permitted, thank you, put in a composting septic system, and sided the whole thing in board and batten cedar that I milled from trees I'd harvested on the property. The smell of fresh-cut cedar in August heat is something you carry in your chest for years. The sound of a hand plane on clean grain, that soft shh, like the wood is exhaling, there's nothing like it. By 2013, I had a 1,400 square foot cabin that was worth somewhere around $160,000 if the market was generous, and worth everything if you were the one who'd built every inch of it. Here's the thing about Whitmore Ridge. That's the unincorporated community I'm technically adjacent to, not inside, but adjacent to. When I bought the property, there was no HOA. There was a loose, informal agreement among about 40 families, mostly old-timers, to maintain the shared gravel road and keep the common areas clean. Reasonable stuff, neighbor stuff. Then, around 2017, a developer named Cresswell Danning bought 20 acres on the East Ridge and started putting up spec cabins, the kind with stained concrete counters, and barn door sliders and shiplap on every surface, designed by an algorithm to appeal to Airbnb tourists who've never chopped wood in their lives. Cresswell filed paperwork to formalize the Whitmore Ridge Homeowners Association, and because he'd bought enough lots, he controlled the founding board. And on that board, sitting like a spider in the center of a very bureaucratic web, was Paulette Voss. Paulette. Let me describe Paulette for you, because you need to understand what we're dealing with. She was 63, immaculate in a way that felt threatening, with the kind of highlighted blonde hair that doesn't move in wind, and a smile that reached her cheekbones, but stopped well short of her eyes. She drove a pearl-white Escalade with an HOA board sticker on the back window. Not an actual official placard, just a sticker she had custom-made, which tells you everything you need to know about Paulette Voss. She lived in the largest of Cresswell's spec builds. She had no professional background in property management, law, or governance. What she had was a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws she'd helped draft, a set of citation pads she'd ordered off Amazon, and a deep, abiding belief that this mountain community would be better off if it looked exactly like the kind of place she imagined when she closed her eyes and thought the word tasteful. My cabin, with its rough cedar siding, its hand-forged iron hardware, its woodpile that was admittedly sometimes visible from the road. My cabin offended Paulette Voss at a cellular level. She'd left notes on my windshield before, sent 2 unofficial courtesy notices. I'd responded to both with polite letters, explaining that my property predated the HOA's jurisdiction, that I was not a dues-paying member, and that I wished her a pleasant day. She did not have a pleasant day. And then, on a Tuesday in October, the letter arrived. The letter was signed by Paulette in her capacity as HOA enforcement chair, a title she'd given herself, which was not actually listed anywhere in the original bylaws, a fact I only discovered later. The letter cited 3 violations. 1. Woodpile visible from shared easement road. 2. Exterior color inconsistent with community palette. 3. Unregistered structure, meaning my tool shed. 72 hours to list the property, $500 per day in fines after that, and a threatening mention of a lien process that, if completed, could complicate future title transfer. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not a litigious person by nature. I spent 30 years as a road engineer. I solve problems with geometry and load-bearing calculations. My default instinct is to find the practical solution, not the dramatic one. So my first move was not to hire a lawyer. My first move was to drive down to the county recorder's office in Haywood County and spend 4 hours pulling every document related to Whitmore Ridge HOA. The gravel parking lot outside the recorder's office smelled like rain-soaked asphalt and old paper when you cracked the door. That particular government building smell of fluorescent lights and manila folders that I've always oddly found calming. I sat at a reader's table with a stack of documents as thick as my forearm. Here is what I found. First, my property. 11 acres, Holt family deed since 1974. The HOA had been incorporated in 2017. The CC&Rs, that's the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which is the legal document that gives an HOA its actual teeth, had been recorded in 2018. For an HOA's CC and RS to bind a property owner, the property must either be formally annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction, with the owner's written consent, or the property must have been sold subject to those covenants after the recording date. I had done neither. I had never signed anything. I had never agreed to annexation. I had purchased nothing after 2018. I had simply been there, minding my own business, cutting my own wood. Takeaway. An HOA cannot legally enforce CC and RS against a property that was never annexed into its jurisdiction with the owner's documented consent. I drove home feeling good, calm even. I typed up a 3-page certified letter to Paulette and the HOA board explaining, with specific document numbers, that my property was not subject to their CC and RS, that no valid lien could attach to my deed for alleged violations of rules I'd never agreed to, and that any further harassment would be met with a tortious interference claim. I sent it certified mail, return receipt. I kept a copy. I slept fine. Paulette did not sleep fine. 3 days later, I came home to find an orange construction-style notice stapled to my front gate post. Not a legal document, just a printed paper with the HOA logo on it, declaring my property in active violation status. She'd also sent a copy to Haywood County's Code Enforcement Department, with a complaint alleging my tool shed was unpermitted. That last part was actually clever, in a petty sort of way, because while I was correct that the HOA had no jurisdiction over me, County Code Enforcement absolutely did. If my shed lacked a permit, that was a real problem regardless of the HOA drama. I called the county. Turns out the shed had been built by my father in 1987 and predated the county's permit requirements for accessory structures under 200 square feet. Exempt. The county inspector I spoke with, a tired-sounding man named Darnell, who clearly had 17 actual problems on his desk, told me, and I'm quoting here, "Sir, this one's not even close. You're fine. Have a nice day." I called Paulette and left a voicemail letting her know what the county said. She filed a second complaint the next morning, alleging my driveway culvert might be improperly sized. The culvert was fine. I'd engineered it myself. But here's where things shifted for me, standing in my kitchen at 7 a.m., listening to the creak outside the window. That cold, steady sound of water over smooth stone that I'd heard every morning for a decade, and realizing that Paulette wasn't going to stop. She didn't want to win on the merits. She wanted to exhaust me, file enough complaints, generate enough noise, cost me enough time and money in responses, and eventually, I'd decide it wasn't worth it. I've been an engineer for 30 years. I have infinite patience for solving problems that other people find tedious. Paulette had made a significant miscalculation. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, pulled up the county GIS parcel map on my laptop, and started looking at the land around Whitmore Ridge with fresh eyes. The Haywood County GIS parcel viewer is, frankly, a work of art if you know how to read it. It's free, it's public, and it shows you every parcel of land in the county, who owns it, what it's assessed at, whether it has any encumbrances, and critically, whether any parcels are flagged as delinquent on property taxes. I zoomed in on Whitmore Ridge. The HOA had its office, and I use that term generously. It was a converted single-wide modular building on a quarter-acre parcel just off the main entrance road to the community. The parcel housed the Community Welcome Center, a mailbox cluster, and a small parking area with a flagpole. Paulette held her board meetings there. She stored her citation pads there. She probably kept a little Keurig and a photo of herself being important. The parcel was owned by the Whitmore Ridge HOA, LLC, and it was 14 months delinquent on property taxes. I will admit that I laughed, out loud, alone in my kitchen, with the kind of laugh that surprises you, a short, involuntary bark that the dog looked up at. I laughed because the organization trying to force me to sell my home for failing to comply with their aesthetic preferences had failed to pay $1,847 in annual property taxes on their own office building. Takeaway: in most U.S. counties, property with delinquent taxes enters a public auction process, meaning any private citizen can ultimately acquire it if the delinquency isn't resolved. Now, I didn't immediately run to buy the land. I'm an engineer. I don't skip steps. First, I needed to understand the full tax lien process in North Carolina, which is specific and somewhat slower than some states. NC gives property owners a significant redemption window, generally up to the point of the auction itself. So I couldn't just swoop in overnight. What I could do was monitor the situation, understand the timeline, and make sure I was positioned. I also called my friend Weston Bramble, a real estate attorney out of Waynesville who I'd worked with on a road easement case years back. Weston has the kind of quiet, unhurried confidence that comes from 30 years of watching people make bad legal decisions. I told him the situation. He was quiet for a moment. The HOA's office parcel is tax delinquent, he repeated. 14 months. Another pause. I could hear him clicking a pen. Garrett, I want you to let me pull a few things. Don't do anything yet, just let me pull a few things. Meanwhile, Paulette escalated. She organized what she called a community safety walkthrough. Essentially, she gathered 5 members of the HOA board and walked the perimeter of my property, taking photographs, which they were legally entitled to do from the road easement. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand. One of the board members, a heavy-set man named Forsyth, who built prefab decks and seemed genuinely uncomfortable being there, made the mistake of making eye contact with me. I gave him a small, neighborly wave. He looked away immediately. Good man. He knew this was wrong. Paulette submitted those photographs to the county with a third complaint, this time alleging that my woodpile constituted a fire hazard in proximity to a shared easement. The county fire marshal's office sent a form letter response within a week. The woodpile was 17 feet from the road edge. Code requires 6. Not even close. 3 complaints. 3 dismissals. Paulette's face, whenever I saw it at the end of the drive or at the mailboxes, had developed a particular quality, a tight, compressed look around the mouth, like someone chronically biting the inside of their cheek. She'd expected me to panic, to lawyer up expensively and quickly, to maybe just sell. What she was getting instead was a retired engineer with nothing but time, a county GIS account, and a real estate attorney friend who called me back on a Thursday afternoon and said, in his slow Waynesville drawl, "Garrett, so, the HOA's tax delinquency just crossed the threshold where the county issues a formal notice of tax foreclosure proceeding. They've got 60 days to pay up before it hits the auction calendar." "Can I buy it at auction?" I asked. "You can, but there's something better." A pause for effect. Weston understood drama. There's a private party that holds a second position lien on that parcel. A contractor, a fella named Burl Ackerman, who built the parking lot for the HOA back in 2019 and never got fully paid. He's been sitting on a mechanics lien for about $8,200. And Burl Ackerman is tired of waiting. I already called him. He'll sell you that lien for $5,000 cash. I looked out my kitchen window at the creek. the sound of cold water over smooth stone. "Wire him the money," I said. Buying a mechanic's lien sounds complicated. It isn't really, not once Weston explained it. Burl Ackerman had a documented, valid lien against the HOA's office parcel for unpaid construction work. That lien was recorded in the County Register of Deeds. By purchasing the lien from Burl, I stepped into his legal shoes. I now had a financial claim against that specific piece of real estate, ahead of many other creditors, secured by the property itself. Takeaway: a mechanic's lien, properly filed, gives the lien holder a security interest in the property, and lien interests can be bought and sold like any other financial instrument. The transaction took 11 days. Weston drafted the lien assignment paperwork. I wired Burl the $5,000. He called me personally to thank me, said he'd been trying to get that money for 4 years and had basically written it off. I told him to buy something nice. He sounded like he might cry a little. I did not tell Paulette any of this. I did not tell anyone. Not my neighbors, not the other old-timers on the ridge who'd been grumbling about the HOA for years. I just quietly went about my life, cutting firewood, consulting on a road drainage project down in Henderson County, maintaining my invisible, officially non-existent exterior color. Paulette, apparently interpreting my silence as defeat, decided to press harder. She called a special HOA board meeting and passed, with 3 of the 5 board votes, a resolution declaring my parcel a nuisance property under the Community Standards Framework. This was a fabricated category with no legal standing outside their own documents, but the resolution was then used to send a formal demand letter from an actual attorney, a man named Prescott Haig out of Asheville, who specialized in HOA enforcement, and whose letterhead included the phrase, "aggressive community compliance solutions," which is honestly one of the darkest sentences I've ever read on professional stationery. Prescott's letter restated the demand to sell. It added a new threat, that the HOA intended to pursue a nuisance abatement action in civil court, which could, he implied, result in forced remediation orders requiring me to modify or remove structures on my property. I forwarded it to Weston. His response, in full: "Prescott Haig is a bully who loses more often than he wins. Write nothing back. Say nothing. Let me handle it." Weston sent Prescott a letter that was, by his own description, politely nuclear. It outlined my property's non-membership in the HOA, cited the 3 dismissed county complaints, questioned the legal basis of the nuisance property designation, and, almost as an aside, mentioned that my attorney was in the process of reviewing the HOA's real property holdings and associated encumbrances for potential adverse action. That last line was intentional. Prescott would pass it to Paulette. Paulette would read, "reviewing the HOA's real property holdings," and not know what it meant. That uncertainty was the point. Let her worry about what I knew, because she almost certainly didn't know about the unpaid contractor and the lien. The HOA board had turned over twice since 2019. Paulette hadn't been involved in the parking lot contract. She'd inherited this mess without knowing it existed. That's the thing about petty power. It rarely comes with full information. Paulette was operating on the assumption that she understood the board, but she didn't understand the ledger. The night after Weston sent that letter, I sat on my porch until past 10 o'clock. October in the Blue Ridge has a smell that I don't know how to fully describe. It's cold air and dying leaves, and the particular dry sweetness of fallen white oak acorns going soft in the gravel. The ridge was dead quiet, except for the distant bark of a neighbor's dog and the sound of the creek. I sat there with a glass of bourbon and a legal pad, and I made a list. The list had 3 columns: what I have, what I need, what happens next. In the what I have column, a mechanic's lien on the HOA's office parcel, a documented paper trail of 3 dismissed county complaints, a real estate attorney who was now visibly enjoying this case, and 11 acres of legally unencumbered family land that I'd built with my own hands. In the what I need column, one more thing, something physical, something that would, at the right moment, give me actual, material control over the situation. Not just legal leverage, physical leverage. I looked at the GIS map again on my phone. I looked at the road, and I found my second piece. Here's something most people don't know about mountain communities with shared gravel roads. Those roads exist on easements. An easement is not ownership, it's a right of use. The road may cross land that belongs to someone entirely separate from the people using it, and the easement describes the terms under which they're allowed to do so. The main entrance road into Whitmore Ridge, the quarter-mile gravel lane that every single property owner, Paulette included, used to get in and out, ran across 2 parcels before it reached the public state road. The first parcel was owned by the HOA. The second parcel, a skinny, irregular 0.4-acre finger of land where the road curved around an old walnut grove, was owned by a woman named Rosalind Fitch, who was 81 years old, lived in Knoxville, and had inherited the land from a great-uncle who died in 2001. She'd never done anything with it. It sat on the county tax rolls, assessed at $4,200, and she paid the taxes every year by automatic bank draft because she'd never gotten around to dealing with the land itself. I found Rosalind Fitch through the county property records and then through a general internet search. I found a phone number through a people search service. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon and identified myself as a neighbor who was interested in purchasing the parcel. She was quiet for a moment. "That little sliver of land?" she said. "Honey, I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for 20 years. What would you want it for?" I told her the truth. I was an adjacent property owner. I had some history with the HOA on the ridge, and I wanted to understand what control that parcel gave me over access to the community road. Another pause. Then, and I will never forget this, Rosalind Fitch started laughing. It was a full, genuine, 70-year laugh. The kind that comes from someone who has seen enough human foolishness to find it truly funny. "Oh, the HOA," she said. "That woman left me a message 2 years ago about community beautification on the parcel." I never called her back. We talked for 40 minutes. I told her my plan. She said she wanted $18,000 for the land, which was more than assessed but less than it was worth as leverage. And I think she priced it exactly where she did because she wanted it to be affordable to me specifically, which made Rosalind Fitch one of my favorite people I've ever spoken to on a telephone. I told her I'd take it. Takeaway. Easement access rights can be dramatically affected by who owns the underlying land. If the easement terms are imprecise, a new landowner has significant leverage over how and whether that access continues. I had Weston review the easement language on the road. It had been drafted in 2018 by the same attorney who'd incorporated the HOA, and it was, Weston's word, sloppy. The easement granted the right-of-way to HOA member properties for residential ingress and egress. It said nothing about the easement surviving changes in ownership of the underlying land. It said nothing about what happened if the underlying parcel owner chose to restrict or condition access. It was, legally speaking, a door left unlocked. I had 2 pieces now, the lien on the office parcel, the land under the entrance road. I needed to bring them together at exactly the right moment. Not too early, when Paulette could find a workaround, and not too late, when she might somehow stumble into fixing her mistakes. I called Weston and told him to start drafting. The next 6 weeks were the most focused and quietly enjoyable of my adult life. There is something deeply satisfying about engineering a solution. Not a destructive solution, not a cruel one, but a precise one. The kind where every element has a function and the whole machine clicks together in a way that's almost beautiful. Let me walk you through what we built, and how, and why each piece mattered. The physical barrier, the gate problem. The 0.4-acre finger parcel I was purchasing from Rosalind contained approximately 180 feet of the entrance road. The road curved through it. There was no alternate route into Whitmore Ridge. The terrain on both sides was too steep for a vehicle bypass. The only way in or out was through that curve. Once I owned the parcel, I could legally install a gate. Not to block emergency access. I wasn't trying to trap anyone or endanger anyone, but to control and condition access consistent with my rights as a landowner. Weston was clear. I needed to maintain emergency vehicle access, which meant the gate needed to be openable, and I needed to document a procedure. That was fine. I didn't want to hurt the neighbors. I wanted to stop Paulette. I had a friend, a retired ironworker named Clifton Rourke, fabricate a heavy steel drive gate, double swing, padlocked, with an entry keypad for access. Clifton built it in his shop, and I picked it up in my truck bed, feeling its weight shift on every corner on the way home. Solid American steel, gray powder-coated, zero drama. I installed the gate posts myself over 3 days using a rented auger. Post holes set in concrete, plumb and level. I hung the gate on a Friday afternoon. Didn't lock it yet, didn't advertise it. Just let it sit there, open, inconspicuous, the way a chess piece can sit on a board for 20 moves without anyone realizing what it's waiting for. The legal structure, the access agreement. Weston drafted what he called an access conditions agreement, a formal document that I would present to the HOA once the moment was right. The agreement stated that, as owner of the parcel underlying a portion of the community entrance road, I was conditioning continued unobstructed access on two things. 1. The HOA's withdrawal of all enforcement actions, fines, and nuisance designations against my property, with written acknowledgement that my property was not subject to HOA jurisdiction. 2. Resolution of the mechanics lien I held on the HOA's office parcel, meaning they had to pay me or arrange a settlement for the underlying obligation. The agreement was perfectly legal. Weston had reviewed case law on similar easement leverage plays in 3 southeastern states. The key was that we weren't threatening anyone illegally. We were exercising property rights that the HOA had carelessly failed to protect when they drafted their founding documents. Takeaway. When an HOA drafts its own easement and property documents without careful legal review, it can create exploitable gaps that adjacent landowners can legally use as leverage. The allies, the Ridge old-timers. I hadn't been silent with everyone. I'd quietly talked to 4 of the other original property owners on the Ridge, people who'd been there before the HOA and who'd been quietly miserable since Paulette's enforcement regime began. There was an older couple, Bertrand and Luann, whose barn had been cited 8 times, a man named Thad who ran a small Christmas tree operation and had been told his signage was visually disruptive to community character. And Rosalind Fitch's distant neighbor, Odalis, a retired school teacher, who'd received a personal note from Paulette suggesting her flower garden was inconsistent with the natural palette. They knew something was coming. They didn't know all the details. I told them to be available on a Saturday in early December, told them to bring their families, and told them that things were probably going to get loud and that they'd want to witness it. Bertrand, who was 77 and had been cutting Christmas trees on that mountain since the Eisenhower administration, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Son, just tell me when to show up." The timing, the annual meeting. The Whitmore Ridge HOA held its annual member meeting every year in the first weekend of December, in the Community Welcome Center, naturally. The meeting was open to all property owners in the area, including non-members, for the public comment portion. Paulette used it as a showcase. She had refreshments. She had a projected slideshow with the phrase, "Building Community Together," on the title slide. This year's meeting was December 7th. I marked my calendar. I called Weston. I called Clifton. I called the 4 neighbors. And I quietly called a reporter at the Asheville Citizen-Times, who covered local real estate and municipal governance, just to let her know that December 7th might be worth a drive. November arrived with the kind of cold that settles into the Blue Ridge, not as a sudden drop, but as a slow, inevitable compression. The air getting denser, the light going steel gray by 3 in the afternoon, the gravel road crackling with frost each morning. I kept my routine. Coffee, work, firewood. I didn't make any sudden moves. Paulette made several. Apparently, Prescott Haig, her HOA enforcement attorney, had gotten spooked by Weston's mention of reviewing the HOA's real property holdings. He advised Paulette to conduct an internal audit. This is when Paulette first discovered the mechanics lien. She called an emergency board meeting in the 2nd week of November. I know this because Forsyth, the uncomfortable deck builder on the board, who'd made eye contact with me during the property walkthrough, left me a voicemail that night. He didn't say much, just that there'd been a meeting, that Paulette was upset about some construction thing from years ago, and that he was, in his words, starting to feel like maybe I don't want to be on this board anymore. I thanked him and told him that if he decided to resign, he should document the circumstances in writing. He resigned the next morning, sent a written statement to the county HOA registry, kept a copy. Minus Forsyth, Paulette now had a 4-person board, 2 of whom were proxies for Cresswell Danning, the original developer, who still held financial interests in several properties on the Ridge, and who Paulette had kept in her orbit as a silent power base. Cresswell was the kind of man who built spec cabins and talked about building community while designing his properties specifically to maximize short-term rental income, which is not building community, it's building an inventory. With the mechanic's lien discovered, Paulette's lawyer had two options: pay it off, which required money the HOA didn't have liquid, or challenge it, which required proving the original contractor's work was defective or the lien improperly filed. Burl Ackerman's work was fine. I'd looked at it. The parking lot was solid. The lien had been properly recorded. Prescott told Paulette this. She did not receive the information gracefully. What she did next was, in retrospect, the move of someone who is losing and doesn't know how to stop. She went to 3 of my neighbors, not the old-timers, but newer arrivals, people who'd bought in after 2018 and who'd never had a problem with the HOA because they'd never given Paulette a reason to have one. And she told them that I was planning to damage property values on the ridge with some kind of legal action. She framed me as a disgruntled outsider trying to destabilize the community. She suggested that any drop in property values would affect their Airbnb income. This was a miscalculation roughly the size of the parking lot she hadn't paid for. Because one of those newer neighbors, a man named Struther, who ran a vacation rental operation and actually cared about property values, came directly to me the same evening to ask what was going on. I showed him the certified letters, the 3 dismissed county complaints, and the timeline. I didn't show him the gate or the lien strategy. That was still in reserve. But I showed him enough. Struther sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "She told me you were the problem." "She has a pattern of telling people that," I said. He left quietly. He didn't go back to Paulette. Meanwhile, Paulette made one more move that crossed a line in a different direction entirely. She contacted my consulting firm's primary client, a county roads department I'd worked with for 8 years, and represented herself as a concerned community member, raising questions about my professional reliability and community standing. She didn't make specific allegations, just planted seeds of vague concern. My client called me immediately. He'd worked with me for 8 years. He knew exactly what a call like that was. He was, to put it mildly, not impressed. He sent Paulette a written response on county letterhead, stating that her communication was unwelcome and that any further contact regarding his contractors would be documented and referred to the county attorney. He also forwarded me a copy. I added it to the file. The file was now substantial. It documented attempted interference with an employment relationship, which has specific legal implications under North Carolina tort law. I gave it to Weston. He made a sound I'd never heard from him before, a low, slow exhale that in a different man might have been a whistle. "She just handed us tortious interference," he said. "Garrett, she just handed it to us." The calendar said November 21st, 16 days until the annual meeting. I want to talk about what I didn't do in those 16 days, because restraint is actually most of the strategy. I didn't call Paulette. I didn't send any letters. I didn't post anything on the neighborhood Facebook group, which had become a semi-functional propaganda channel for HOA announcements. I didn't tell the old-timers the full plan, just confirmed the date and told them to show up early. I let the silence do work. Because here's what silence does to a person like Paulette Voss. It makes them escalate. When the person they're trying to intimidate stops reacting, they don't pause and reconsider. They push harder. Because the absence of a response reads to them as weakness. They assume they're winning. And when you're the one who's actually winning, that assumption is a gift. On November 29th, Paulette distributed a notice to all HOA members, announcing a special enforcement update at the December annual meeting, specifically referencing the ongoing situation with the non-compliant adjacent parcel, my parcel. She was going to make a public example of me. That was her plan, to stand at the front of the room, present her citations and fines, and invite the assembled community to validate her authority. I want her to do exactly that. While Paulette was composing notices, I was doing 3 things. First, Weston finalized the access conditions agreement and the formal demand letter we'd serve on the HOA board. Clean, precise, legally airtight. We had the lien documentation. We had the parcel deed for the entrance road, closed with Rosalind on November 19th. She sent me a handwritten note with the signed documents, which I kept. And we had the tort documentation from the employment interference stunt. Second, I had Clifton Rourke come out to look at the gate installation and confirm it was mechanically solid. He walked the hinge pins, checked the padlock mechanism, tested the swing on both panels. The gate stood 8 feet wide and 5 feet tall, powder-coated gray against the brown of the walnut trees behind it. It was, objectively, a handsome gate. It opened and closed with the quiet, solid thud of something built correctly. Clifton looked at it the way craftsmen look at their own work. Not with pride exactly, but with a kind of satisfied accuracy. "She's not getting through that without a key or a cutting torch," he said. "That's all I need," I said. Third, I made a phone call to 3 other adjacent property owners who were not HOA members, people who'd been left out of the original jurisdictional scope and who, like me, had been receiving informal pressure. I told them what was happening. I told them they might want to consult their own attorneys about their status. I gave them Weston's number. He agreed to provide a free initial consultation. 2 of the 3 called him. 1 retained him. The HOA was now, potentially, looking at coordinated legal pushback from 4 separate non-member property owners. On December 3rd, 4 days before the annual meeting, Paulette did something that managed to surprise even me. She filed a civil lawsuit in Haywood County Court against me personally, seeking injunctive relief, requiring me to bring my property into compliance with the C&Rs. It was a desperate move. Legally thin, as Weston pointed out immediately, given that we'd already established I wasn't subject to the C&Rs. But filing it served a purpose. It let Paulette announce at the annual meeting that she'd taken legal action, which would look decisive to the membership. It was theater. It cost the HOA around $2,500 in attorney's fees to file theater. Weston's response was a motion to dismiss, citing, at considerable length, the absence of any jurisdictional basis for the claim. He also cross-filed on my behalf a tortious interference complaint related to the employment contact. The cross-filing had the effect of potentially making Paulette personally liable, not just the HOA entity. Prescott Haig, her attorney, called Weston on December 5th to discuss a potential resolution. Weston told him he was happy to discuss a resolution at the annual meeting on December 7th, in front of the community. Prescott was quiet for a moment. "That's a public forum," he said. "It certainly is," Weston said. I spent the evening of December 6th on my porch, watching the last light go off the ridge. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and the creek had a skin of ice along the slow edges. Somewhere in the tree line, a great horned owl ran through its territorial call, low, rhythmic, unhurried. A sound that has been happening in these mountains for 10,000 years, and will be happening long after Paulette Voss's HOA is a footnote in a county recorder's archive. I went inside, set my alarm for 6 a.m., and slept better than I had in weeks. December 7th, 31 degrees at dawn, frost on every surface, the gravel road through the walnut grove sparkling like something out of a snow globe. I was up at 6, had the truck loaded by 7:30. Weston in the passenger seat with a leather document portfolio on his lap, a copy of every relevant filing, deed, and letter in a binder I'd color-tabbed. And, in my jacket pocket, the padlock key to the gate on Rosalind Fitch's old parcel, which I now owned. We drove up to the entrance road at 8 a.m., 90 minutes before the meeting. The gate was still standing open from the previous evening, as it had been every day since installation. I had never locked it, never needed to. I locked it now. Clifton's gate swung closed with that solid, definitive thud of good steel, and I snapped the padlock. I placed a laminated notice on the gate that read, in clear 16-point type, "This parcel is private property. Access is conditioned upon written agreement with the landowner. For access inquiries, contact Weston Bramble, attorney at law," followed by his phone number. Then I walked back to the truck and drove around to the other public road that accessed the community's overflow parking area, a longer route, not the main entrance, and parked legally. The annual meeting started at 9:30. By 9:15, 7 vehicles were backed up at the locked gate. By 9:25, Paulette Voss's pearl white Escalade was among them, and I could see, even from 50 yards, the particular stiffness in the way she was standing outside her vehicle. She called the sheriff's department. A deputy arrived by 9:40, a young man who, to his credit, listened to both sides with complete patience before explaining to Paulette that the gate was on private property, the notice was properly posted, and that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one. He could not force open a private gate. He suggested she contact the property owner's attorney. She had his number. It was on the sign. Weston was already inside the community welcome center. He'd arrived via the overflow route early and had been waiting, seated quietly in the back with his document portfolio. The 8 people who'd made it through before I locked the gate were seated, including Bertrand and Luann, Thad, O'Dallas, and Struther. The Asheville Citizen-Times reporter, Devorah Crane, was in the second row with a notebook and a phone recording. Paulette arrived 11 minutes late, visibly agitated, having had to park on the public road and walk a quarter-mile in dress shoes on frozen gravel. I want you to picture that. I want you to understand the particular satisfaction of watching someone experience, in miniature, the inconvenience they've spent 2 years trying to inflict on others. She took her place at the front of the room. She had her slideshow ready, Building Community Together, title slide. She began her prepared remarks about the enforcement update. She got approximately 4 minutes in before Weston stood up. "Excuse me," he said, in the same quiet, unhurried voice he probably used ordering lunch. "Before we get to the enforcement presentation, I need to serve the board with some documents." He walked to the front and placed a stapled packet in front of each of the 4 remaining board members. He placed a copy on the podium in front of Paulette. He returned to his seat. The room was silent, except for the sound of paper. "What is this?" Paulette said. "That," Weston said, "is a formal demand letter regarding the access conditions agreement for the parcel underlying your entrance road, which Mr. Holt purchased on November 19th. It also contains notice of his intent to enforce the mechanics lien he acquired on this building's parcel for the unpaid contractor obligation. And it includes documentation of a tortious interference claim arising from your contact with Mr. Holt's professional client in November." Paulette stared at the document. I watched her read. I watched the moment she reached the parcel deed. I watched the moment she understood. "He owns the entrance?" someone said from the audience. "The parcel underlying the entrance, yes," Weston said. Devorah Crane's pen was moving fast. "This is fraud," Paulette said. Her voice had gone tight and high. "This is illegal. He blocked our road." "He exercised his property rights," Weston said evenly. "The access conditions agreement, which you're holding, describes the terms under which those conditions would be removed. Mr. Holt has no interest in inconveniencing the general membership. He has a very specific interest in resolving a targeted, documented harassment campaign against his property." He paused. "The gate key is available upon execution of that agreement." Cresswell Danning, who had slipped in during the commotion and whose financial exposure from the lien was now also in play, leaned over to Prescott Haig and said something in a low voice. Prescott nodded. Then Prescott stood. "Mr. Bramble," he said, "I think we should discuss a resolution." "I think so too," Weston said. The slideshow behind Paulette still said Building Community Together. She hadn't moved. The agreement was signed 17 days later, on December 24th. And yes, I recognized the timing. And yes, I found it satisfying in a way I'm not entirely ashamed of. Here's what the resolution contained. The HOA formally withdrew all enforcement actions, fines, and nuisance designations against my property, with written acknowledgement that my parcel had never been subject to HOA jurisdiction. That acknowledgement was recorded in the County Register of Deeds. Permanent, public, searchable. The mechanics lien was resolved by a cash settlement of $6,500, paid from the HOA's operating fund, which meant that the dues of every member on the ridge were effectively reimbursing me for a lien I'd bought for $5,000. My net recovery, $1,500, plus legal fees covered separately under the tortious interference settlement, which totaled $4,200. I unlocked the gate. Then I opened it permanently and removed it from the posts, because I had no desire to restrict access to the community. I only ever wanted the leverage. The gate now lives in Clifton Rourke's shop. He says he'll use the panels for something eventually. Good steel doesn't go to waste. Paulette Voss resigned from the HOA board in January, citing personal reasons. The real reasons were in Devorah Crane's article, which ran in the Citizen-Times the 3rd week of December under the headline, "Mountain HOA's Enforcement Tactics Draw Legal Challenge from Non-Member Neighbor." It was not a flattering piece. It was a thorough piece. Devorah had spoken with Forsyth, with Struther, with Bertrand and Luann. The paper trail was extensive. Cresswell Danning sold his last 3 spec properties on the Ridge by spring and moved his development operation to a different county. He didn't say goodbye. The HOA itself didn't dissolve. There were legitimate members who actually valued the road maintenance coordination and the shared area upkeep, and they deserved to have a functional organization. What changed was the board. Forsyth came back. Struther joined. O'Dallas, the retired school teacher with the flower garden, was elected president, which might be my favorite outcome of the entire situation. She called me in February to ask if I'd consider becoming an informal advisor on the road maintenance agreement. I told her I'd think about it. I'm thinking yes. Now, for the part of the story that matters most to me personally. My dad bought that 11 acres in 1974 for $8,000. He hunted it, camped it, loved it. He never got to see the cabin finished. He died before the foundation was poured. Every board I milled, every nail I drove, every window I hung in that place was a conversation I was having with him. The idea that I might lose it, not to a fair market transaction or an honest legal dispute, but to a woman with a citation pad and a custom sticker on her bumper. That idea did something to me I wasn't fully prepared for. So when this was over, I did 2 things. I planted 20 white oak saplings on the east edge of the property, the edge that faces the entrance road. They'll be mature trees in 40 years, long after I'm gone. A small conservation commitment, recorded as a voluntary easement with the county land trust, ensuring that strip of the ridge can never be developed. And I set up a small scholarship fund through the Haywood County Community Foundation, $500 per year, awarded to a graduating senior from the local high school who's pursuing vocational or technical training, carpentry, electrical, civil construction. My dad was a working man. This seemed right.
Garrett didn't celebrate. No party, no post. He just unlocked that gate, drove home, and poured himself a coffee while the creek ran behind his cabin, same as any other morning. But something was permanently different. Paulette walked into this with an embossed letterhead and 72 hours to put some man of land his father bought in 1974. She fingered his penny, lawyer up fast, burned through saving, and eventually just sold. She miscalculated one thing. A man who poured his own foundation doesn't have a surrender threshold. $500 a day in finance. She thought that number bought compliance. Turns out, it just bought Garrett time. Time to pull county records, find a forgotten puzzle, and pick up broad arguments liens for $5,000. Petty powers almost never reads its own paperwork. Here's my questions for you. If that letter shows up in your mailbox tomorrow, do you know what land you're actually standing on? Do you know what your easement says? Garrett did, not because he's a lawyer, because he paid attention. Drop your HOA story in the comments. I read everyone. Like, subscribe. Next story's already waiting. The This Doesn't Lie, people do.